Hi, Victoria.
Hello.
How are you?
Are you able to hear me okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay,
Perfect.
fantastic. Is it okay if
Yes.
I try and share my screen just so we can make sure that's...
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Okay. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, it is perfect.
Okay.
Great.
It's a bit off-putting because I can't see you, but you know what? Here's what we'll do. We'll just keep doing this. But you
I
can see
know.
me as well on the bottom?
Yeah, it works out
Okay.
perfectly. Yeah, it's hard sometimes with technology, it's always kind of you hope for the best and cross your fingers.
For sure. It's like when I lecture right now, I'm just talking to my wall. So you know what? We'll work with it.
Yeah. It's probably so odd to think that that's what we do now, but hopefully soon or maybe in the fall that you can lecture in person.
Yeah, I'm hoping that there's a safe way that we can all come back together at some point soon.
Yeah, for sure.
How are you doing? Are you enjoying the day?
Yeah, it's not too bad. I mean, in London, we've had some pretty nice weather recently. We just got some rain like a couple days ago, but other than that, it's been quite warm, so pretty enjoyable here, actually.
That's great. That's really good.
How about you?
Yeah, it's been really lovely. Today's not as nice outside, but we did get the kids out for a bike this morning and they had a few activities. So we've been out a bit today, but it's probably a good day to be indoors because it's not as
Yeah, for
nice as it
sure.
was.
Yeah, are your kids able to go to school in person?
Yeah, so they've been back since the end of January, that lockdown. They've been back in person. So, really thriving and enjoying that. And then some of their activities have also started again, which is fantastic. It's definitely helpful for them to get back into
Yeah,
some sort of normal.
for sure. And
Mhm.
probably nice also because I'm sure having them around you definitely probably can't focus as well on your work. So,
It's, yeah, I learned a lot about grade three and grade one curriculum in January.
learning
I
your
bet you.
shapes again, I'm sure.
I absolutely, there's a whole new way to do math apparently. So I'm
Yeah,
learning.
that's what I hear a lot of people say that it's no longer just like adding the way that, we all learned the classics. Apparently now they have some ways you draw boxes and come up with crazy ways to do it.
Yeah, it's different. I understand it now that I see it, but it was very foreign to me at the beginning of January. But
hmm
we are adapting. We are adapting.
Yeah. Well, maybe just wait until 2:40. I can see some people are still rolling in, so just to get everyone the opportunity to listen.
For sure. I also, having been on a few of the other presentations, I added a slide where there's like this very natural break because I recognize that we want to have a little break in the middle, then come back and then have a discussion at the end.
For
So
sure.
I added that. You'll see it on the screen. So it's a good segue for you if you wanted to take over there to ask questions in the middle.
Great. Yeah, I will for sure be able to do that. Okay, I'm sure we can get started. If anyone's rolling in now, they can just join in whenever they get here. But welcome to the final speaker of the afternoon, everyone. My name is Victoria Corbett, and I am a member of the varsity figure skating team here at Western. So this session will last about 40 minutes, and speakers will take a break at around the 15-minute mark to answer a few questions and then return back to their presentation. And we will conclude with a few more questions at the end. Following this session, we will wrap up our Stay in the Game conference. So I encourage everyone to use the chat function to generate conversations and questions. So this is how we will communicate. Only presenters, so Shannon and I, will have access to the audio and visual components. So please use the chat function, ensuring you use the session chat, not the event chat, just to make sure we're all able to see the questions here right now. And so I am pleased to introduce Dr. Shannon Kerwin, who will be speaking about dealing with conflict in the sports setting. Shannon is a professor of sport management at Brock University, conducting research in the field of human resource management in the world of sport. Shannon specializes in how personal and organizational values coincide to enhance organizational outcomes, the role of conflict in the effectiveness of volunteer boards of directors, as well as the development and fostering of leadership within the context of team culture. She currently works with Canadian Women in Sport, investigating human resource management practices that support or obstruct gender diversity in nonprofit sports organizations. Shannon is also a volunteer coach and a former soccer all-star. Her talk with us today will focus on preparing ourselves for conflict and tension in positions of coaching, volunteering, and sports administration. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Shannon Kerwin, and I will now pass it over to you, Shannon.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversations that have happened over the last few hours. Certainly has emphasized the power of settings like this, and also just the great discussion that can be had in this space regarding women in sport. So as mentioned, I'm Shannon Kerwin. I go by the pronouns she and her. I also want to recognize that I'm presenting from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and I invite you to reflect on the land that you're currently occupying as well. So saying that, today I'm presenting dealing with conflict in the sports setting. And so this actually really ties in well. I was sitting in on Alex's presentation just a few hours ago, and she talked a lot about identity, and we did not plan this, but I'm certainly going to cross over a lot with her discussion. So that works out well in this setting. But who am I? So I want to give you a little bit of a background on who I am and the identity that I bring to this presentation, and then the work that I do. So as a researcher and as a teacher in the space of organizational behavior and human resource management, I recognize it's also really important when we are exploring our roles and our place in soccer, soccer in sport, I'm going to talk about soccer, that we understand the experiences that someone brings to the table. And so that's where I'm going to take a step back, and a big step back, to talk to you about who I am. So the big step back is, I am Shannon Kerwin, but my maiden name is Shannon Ham. And Shannon Ham played club level soccer for a very long time. So I played club level soccer in Burlington, Ontario. And in 1996, so that's why I say a big step back, in 1996, my club level team won the national championships in soccer. And from there, because of that championship season, I had the opportunity to play for our provincial team as well as our national team. And then also at that point in time, I was heading into high school. So throughout high school, I was getting interest in terms of scholarship opportunities. So a big part of my identity was Shannon Ham, the soccer player. Unfortunately, throughout my high school career in the club level system, I suffered multiple concussions. And by the end of high school, I was then unable to play soccer anymore. So this shifted my identity quite a bit. And it really ties into everything Alex was talking about in her presentation, resonates with me. Now Shannon, the adult, the mother, the parent, the wife, the researcher, all of these identities, but also recognizing that my identity in that moment in high school when I couldn't play anymore was Shannon Ham, the soccer player. Now what do I do with my life? It was if I could use the term, and I don't want to be over dramatic, but it was a devastating transition for me. So saying that, I removed myself from soccer. So through my undergraduate degree, my master's, I didn't even look at a soccer field, didn't coach, I completely removed myself from the game. But then I look, and if I continue on with my journey, when I was doing my PhD at Western, so I did my PhD at Western under Dr. Alison Doherty, who I know is heavily involved in this event. While I was in London, actually one of my girlfriends, Colleen, she said, do you want to help me coach the U8, U9 girls team here? So at that point, I didn't have kids of my own. I hadn't been back on the field for a long period of time, but this was a friend who didn't really know my connection to soccer. I'd met Colleen after high school. And I thought, you know what, this might be a good way to reconnect with a sport that I had once loved. So I ended up coaching with Colleen, and it was a really great experience. And it was my first step back into the sport after sort of losing that identity in high school. From there, I then moved on to my first academic position at the University of Florida. So I had a faculty position at UF in Gainesville, Florida. And just by chance, I ended up working on a research project with the University of Florida women's soccer team. And their coach, Becky Burley, I can't speak highly enough of this woman, but she's coached for many years, a very, very successful program there. But part of my research project was to explore what she has on her team, which is a development program for her players, where they're not only developing as players, but on a personal level. And I recognized through that project the power of servant leadership and how effective it can be for a high-level coach to develop her players on and off the field and their identity on and off the field, on the field of play. So really, really impactful project, impactful professionally in terms of my research agenda, but also just personally to see what someone who can be successful on the field, but also develop their athletes off the field, how powerful that can be. So definitely a really meaningful project. And then now moving from the University of Florida, I came back home and started my position at Brock in 2010. So now I'm working in the field of sport. I'm constantly engaged with sport in the classroom, in the research projects that I do. Then also re-engaging with soccer specifically, I started coaching my daughter. So my daughter, who is now 9, I started coaching her at the U6 level, and I coached her on my own at the U6 level. And then now I coach both my son and my daughter under the U9 category, and then my son under the U7 category this year. And I bring this up because this particular experience and now coaching, so I'm coaching the sport of soccer in the Niagara region, it relates to the conflict scenario that I'm going to talk about. And because I used to coach on my own. So I coached my daughter on my own when I first came back, and now I coach with my husband. And that's an important piece of reflection and important conversation to have today, because one, this particular transition from coaching on my own to coaching with my husband connects to the safe sport context and the conflict episode that I'm going to talk about. But it's also my way, coaching my son and my daughter, to show them both the meaning of having a strong female in a leadership position. So to me, that's a really important piece of my identity right now, is showing my son and my daughter that there can be females in strong leadership positions and what that looks like. So it's just a norm for them now to know that mommy's going to be out there helping them coach, and she's going to be effective in that role. And so that is a really important piece of my identity and some of the work that we're doing here. So saying that, giving you the background, showing you a piece of who I am, what we're going to talk about today is conflict and disagreement. And so I'm coming at this conversation with all of those pieces of my identity. So the key piece and the key point that I want to highlight, whether you're a coach, administrator, an athlete, is recognizing that disagreement and conflict is inevitable in sport and in society. Conflict is going to happen, and we oftentimes shy away from it, but it needs to be managed. And one of the things that I want to highlight, and hopefully is emphasized through the conversation, is that we must manage conflict in a productive way for girls and women specifically. And we need to have the confidence to stand up for what we believe in and also mitigate some of those negative outcomes that can result. So there are certainly negative outcomes that can result from conflict. We want to mitigate those so that we're not pushing really, really strong girls and women out of sport because of unmanaged conflicts. We want to make sure that we have these conversations, we create a toolbox so that we can manage that conflict as it's unfolding. So where to start? And this is where my research comes into play. So my dissertation research at Western was on conflict and conflict management. And it's really, really important to dissect what conflict and disagreement looks like so that we can appropriately manage it. The key piece here, conflict is not always bad. And I put this in green for a reason, because text color does matter. If you put it in red, you're thinking, okay, maybe conflict's negative, but conflict is not always bad. And so what do I mean by that? And how does that unfold from the theoretical perspective in the research space that I'm in, but even just from your own practical experience, what does that look like? And I'll use an example that is on the field of play so we can really unpack this notion of conflict. So theoretically, there are 3 types of conflict. So not just this negative relationship conflict that we usually focus on. So the first type of conflict that we have is task conflict. And this is, as it sounds, disagreements about the tasks themselves. So if I put it into a sport perspective, that's, let's say I'm on a coaching staff, I'm the head coach and my assistant coach. We're trying to decide on who should be captain for the upcoming season. And perhaps I think that Ashley should be captain and my co-coach thinks that Janine should be captain. We start to disagree about that choice, and the disagreement that ensues based on that task of choosing the captain is the task conflict or the task disagreement. And we'll unpack that a little bit in the next slide. The next type of conflict is process conflict. So in the similar situation, we're trying to choose the captain. The process conflict would be disagreement over how we're going to achieve the task. So in the same situation, if I'm on a coaching staff and one of my coaches believes that we should choose the captain by consensus, and another thinks that we should choose the captain by majority rules. We're disagreeing over the process of actually choosing the captain. So that in and of itself is another form of disagreement that we can see unfolding. The last type of conflict is relationship conflict. And this is what we typically focus on. It's what resonates with us. It's that the personal attack that you feel. It's the emotional reaction that we have. It's when people just don't like each other in a disagreement and therefore it becomes personal and becomes negative. So we typically focus on relationship conflict when someone says conflict or disagreement. That's what we immediately go to inherently as human beings. And so it's important to recognize, yes, that is a type of conflict that will occur, but we also have these 2 other types of conflict, task and process conflict, that aren't always bad in terms of the impact on groups and group functioning.
And I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm not sure if I'm the only one. I'm not seeing your slides switch.
They're not switching?
I'm not sure if I'm the only one that is. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Okay, you know what? I'll leave them like this instead of presentation view. Does that help? Like, can you see that now when I'm moving them?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Awesome. I'm sorry. There we go. So you've just been hearing my voice. That's not fun. Okay, so here we go. I'll leave them in this mode and that hopefully that's a bit clear.
Perfect.
So then if we're looking at these 3 types of conflict, what I have here then we will start to unpack the outcomes of what happens with unmanaged conflict or managed conflict depending on the situation. So what I have in red and in black are the outcomes related to conflict, and it's typically related to the outcomes of relationship conflict. And this might resonate with you as you think of maybe a disagreement that you had with someone in the past or a conflict that you've engaged in. Frustration, dysfunction, withdrawal, silence, being uncomfortable, being angry. Those are all some outcomes that we can see when we're looking at relationship conflict in particular. But what I want to draw your attention to, and a good focus of our talk today, is what's in green. So decision quality, innovation, compromise. So one of the things, or what I will draw your attention to, is if we go back to the example that I provided for the task conflict. So if I'm on the coaching staff and I think that Ashley should be the captain of my team, and my co-coach thinks that Janine should be the captain of my team, when we disagree, if it's a functional disagreement and there's no emotion involved and we haven't laced in our relationship conflict, so if this is just purely a disagreement, what's happening during that discussion is that there's more ideas coming out. So maybe I start to hear, I didn't know that Janine was so active outside of the team context. Off the field, she's really supportive to her teammates. She's engaged in a lot of community initiatives. I didn't know that. And now that I've engaged in this disagreement, now I have that context. So maybe now I'm going to make a higher quality decision on the captain of our team because I have that information. So that's part of this reflection on there can be positive outcomes of those task disagreements. So decision quality, again, innovation, compromise. These are outcomes that we can certainly experience if conflict is managed appropriately. So what I'm going to do for the remainder of this discussion is I'm going to give you a scenario that is relevant for me. So this is something that happened to me as a coach in the youth sport context. And as I'm discussing this experience, I want you to think about times where this this particular experience might resonate with you. Perhaps you had experienced a similar episode with someone where where a relationship has unfolded. After I go through this scenario, that's where we'll have a little pause, and I want you to think about some of those times where maybe this particular example I'm giving you resonates with you. And then I'll get into, after that question period, talking about a few ways that we can manage this situation proactively as well as reactively in order to create some safer sport contexts around conflict. So here's the example. So again, this is a situation that happened to me. It certainly impacted me and my decisions to engage in coaching in the youth sport context. So at this point, this is when I first moved back to Canada, and I am now coaching my daughter. So coaching a U6 girls team. This is the first time I've been back coaching since my children were born, and that reconnection with the sport of soccer. It's very important to highlight here, I was coaching on my own. So this is where I was coaching. I didn't have an assistant coach. It was just me on my own coaching this group of 8 little girls. A piece to pin here, I missed the orientation and was not given another opportunity for training. So at the beginning of the season, the club did offer orientation and training for all the coaches involved in the youth club context. I had signed up late to coach and I missed that opportunity. So I pinned this because it's on me. I didn't follow up to get that additional training and orientation. And then the club never followed up either. So the two of us, in terms of where there might have been a gap here, and I'm now talking about proactively managing some of these conflict situations, that training and orientation never occurred. And again, I take some of that blame, and then also the club never followed up. So those are two pieces that are important to this context. Moving more into the experience. The girls that I was coaching were wonderful. They were very enthusiastic. A few were very talented and always very good listeners. Now here's the conflict situation. So one of the fathers was always very vocal. And to put this into context, what happened every Saturday while I was coaching was that 40 minutes of the coaching session on every Saturday morning was a practice. So we'd engage in a little practice with the girls, working on skills, drills, and improving some of their fitness. The last 20 minutes of each of those sessions was a half field game with the other team that had been occupying the space. So every week we'd rotate, but these were games where myself and the coach of the other team would be the officials to the game, and we'd monitor all of the play and make sure that the girls were keeping the ball in and making sure that there was no rough play involved in the game. Several times prior to this incident, this one particular father had voiced concerns. He was never overly aggressive, but he was certainly bringing up issues that were underlying, and we never really addressed it. So that's the one thing that I want to keep in mind as I'm talking about this conflict situation, is this individual brought up things that he wasn't necessarily agreeing with prior to what I'm going to now address as the relationship conflict. But we never addressed it. We kind of just brushed it aside, and that is in and of itself a problem. Nonetheless, this one game that I'm going to refer to, the father got very heated that his daughter was pushed by a player on the other team. So we're playing another team. The other coach was also a young mother, so I want to highlight that as well. He proceeded to get up and yell in curse words at the other coach, the parents, some of the things that came out of his mouth. Why isn't there a referee here? What are you going to do about this? The explicit, I've removed. My daughter can't play in this, explicit. So all of this was a very, very heated discussion. The girls on the field were terrified. This man was yelling words I know many of them hadn't heard before. We tried to manage the man's expectations and emotions, but he was absolutely out of control. At this point, the convener had to intervene, and this situation made me question my desire to coach. So my desire to coach my daughter and my desire to move forward and coach in the youth sports setting. So a lot is happening in this one situation, and then the impact of the situation certainly has moved forward. But what I want to do now is just stop and pause for a second. I'm going to get in, as I mentioned, I'm going to get into how we could potentially proactively and reactively manage this situation. But does the situation resonate with you? Have you been involved in a conflict or disagreement that made you question your place in sport or feel unsafe? And what did you do in those situations? So I do want to pause here to take time to reflect on those questions.
Thank you for sharing, Shannon, your experiences as well as a short story or experience that, everyone can kind of relate to in some sense of or another in terms of conflict and knowing your place or how far to go kind of idea. So I definitely think that that was a great kind of analogy and experience. Maybe right now we can stop for some questions and then get back into your presentation along with this scenario, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. That would be great. And again, this is just a prompt, but if you have questions about anything else that I talked about, absolutely, that's up for grabs too.
Awesome. Great. So if anyone has a question in mind, feel free to write it or a comment. We see that there's a few comments about, your situation and people, there's parents that sometimes, as Melissa Bartlett said, bring so much bias into their judgment of situations. We have another comment that says they don't think that they've been in this situation, but I find myself reacting to it by taking a deep breath, which I expect is what I would do in this situation. So yeah, definitely many people who relate. We do have one question from Sarah, and she said, Shannon, did you feel extra unsafe being yelled at by a male?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really appreciate that question. And it's kind of what I get into when we talk about managing this situation. I was terrified, if I'm being honest, in this situation. So this gentleman was quite a bit bigger than me. And also, as he's yelling these things, he was in our faces. So he was absolutely in the face of the other coach and also came to me as well. Understanding that he was frustrated in the situation, but in that moment I can reflect back now and try and give him credit for why he was so angry. But in that moment I was absolutely terrified. And one of the questions that I pose when I talk about what we can do to manage this, one of the things that went through my head afterwards was, would he have been that aggressive had it been two male coaches on the field? I don't know the answer to that. But that was one of the questions that constantly ran through my head was, okay, this person lost control, and would he have been that aggressive had it been two male coaches? And again, I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly something that went through my mind. And absolutely, I was quite scared in the moment.
Very understandable. We do have another question pertaining to this situation from Caroline. She said, how did the other parents respond to this situation?
So I don't know if I was going to say funny enough, but it's not funny. But I think it was telling how terrifying it was and how almost instantaneously it happened. And I think that's why I picked this story, is because it happened. It almost came out of nowhere. And so everybody was sitting there shell shocked in terms of just, okay, what do we do with this person? And I think it was because it almost felt irrational why he was so aggressive. But then again, I'll get to this into the question period as part of when I dissect this a little bit, but I think part of it was that he had similar concerns about the quality of control on the field that we never addressed building up to this. So several weeks before he had comments, and we didn't address it. And so I think that's why it blew up into the situation so quickly on this particular day. But because it just happened so quickly, all of the parents they were in shock, I think. And I think our other concern too was the words that were coming out of I gave you a sample of the curse words that were occurring. But I know for sure my daughter had never heard those words before. And it was almost trying to shield the children more than anything. But saying that, the one response that was very much appreciated and helped with the safe sports space was the convener. I don't even know where he came from, but he was immediately there helping us, which absolutely helped us feel a bit safer. And I know as a proactive strategy for creating safe sports space, the convener was always there. It wasn't just happening. It just didn't happenstance that he was there. He was always circulating all of the fields. And in that moment, I was so grateful for that. So that the other parents didn't do much. I think we were all just shocked. But the convener jumping in absolutely was helpful.
Definitely very helpful, because that kind of just provides a barrier for you to feel a little more at ease. So we have one more question from Anne, and she asked, has some has some of the conflict you've endured felt driven by by factors other than the scenario, so potentially other than soccer? So for example, they gave like sexism or racism. Have you ever felt in that situation before?
Yeah, I can't speak to being driven by racism. I'm being a white woman in this space, respecting that people who are racialized or from marginalized groups might feel a little differently in terms of how they experience racism. But absolutely, sexism has played a role in terms of I'm confident that part of that the way in which that father reacted to us had to do with me being female and the other coach being female. And that's also happened in other spaces too, where some of the disagreement has come from. I think it's a perception that I don't know or understand sport because I'm female. So I can absolutely say I've felt that in other scenarios as well, particularly in the coaching space. And part of that too is, and I will address this, is I now coach with my husband who knows nothing about soccer, but as a part of my own way to feel safe in this coaching setting. And a lot of the experiences that I have are in some ways rooted in sexism, in that many people will go to my husband first with questions. And my assumption is it's because he's male. But he readily admits, I know nothing about soccer. I'm here to be the cheerleader more than anything. But it's that experience there immediately turns to a sexist point of view in terms of who has the knowledge. They immediately go to the male in the situation. In this case, is my husband. So there's been a lot of experiences that I know are rooted in sexism, particularly related to coaching in this space.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I definitely can see how that can be a difficult pill to swallow sometimes. We have another question from Kathy. So she mentioned that she's a parent, and her experience has been that both male and female, sometimes like training has been like mandatory, how that has been helpful. Have you seen any, shifts or progress in terms of parent expectations, or maybe when you started coaching, how there wasn't really much expectation, but how they've switched, or has it kind of just been the same and not really addressed in your experience?
Yeah, a part of it is for myself as a coach, I have to own that in my case, the scenario that I provided you, I had missed the training and orientation because I'd started late and I didn't follow up to engage in that training and orientation. I feel like it was mandatory at the time, but there was no check and balance in terms of whether or not I had engaged in that training and orientation. And then again on myself, and this is one of the points I'll end with when I continue on with the presentation, is that I now recognize the value of training and orientation. Even back then, I was teaching and researching in HR, talking about training and orientation, but to be in that space, recognizing, wow, that would have helped me, I think, to a large degree. I now, every situation and every role that I engage in where there's training and orientation, I make sure that I attend because I know that there's valuable information. And now I've experienced firsthand where a breakdown can occur and have a pretty negative outcome. And so I'm not sure that training and orientation would have helped me, but I don't know that it wouldn't have helped me either. So I really respect that yes, training and orientation now, especially are mandatory when we have COVID protocol and we're looking at safe sports space. But even saying that from this experience, I now know that I will be attending every training and orientation that is offered to me in a volunteer position.
Perfect. And just going off that, I think we might have time for one more question before we get right back into the presentation from Caroline. And she said, would you recommend local sports organizations considering offering an orientation to parents to lessen the chance of these situations happening? Or do you think that, kind of as you mentioned, you don't know how, if it would have necessarily stopped it from happening?
Yeah, I think I may have misheard that, or I misinterpreted the question before in terms of having parents involved in that training and orientation. Yeah, absolutely. I think that would help. Part of what I think is also a big piece is recognizing how we can engage in some of this disagreement about other pieces. So what are parents concerned about? What what might they not agree with in terms of what's happening on the field, and having an outlet for that. Because I truly believe, now that I've had time to reflect back on this situation, was that the father had a lot of concerns about what was happening on the field, that there wasn't a referee involved, that maybe his daughter wasn't getting the treatment that he thought she deserved. And he didn't have an outlet for that because he had voiced these concerns earlier on, and we just never addressed them. I, at that point, didn't really know how to address them. I didn't have the confidence to address them. I think that's another piece too. But those concerns were never really heard. And then because of that, this just blew up. I think his reaction was completely unwarranted, but I think it was this festering frustration that he had. And then it just blew up because his reaction didn't match what was happening on the field. But I do think it was a buildup. So to your question, I think this maybe mandatory training and orientation, or a way in which parents can discuss some of their frustrations throughout the course of a season, might be helpful. And that might be on the club, but it also might be on me as a coach to find a safe space where I'm comfortable doing that. I think is also important for me to engage in as well, to make sure my parents have a voice and that I listen.
Thank you. I think we should probably head back into your presentation now. And for the questions, keep them coming. Shannon will be answering them at the end of the presentation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. I've really appreciated this dialogue, and it ties into the rest of my presentation in terms of, well, where do we go from here? I'm getting from the question period that this isn't new to anyone. The story that I shared, it may have happened to you. You may have seen something like this happen. It's common in sport when we're seeing, particularly youth sport, when we see these interactions between coaches and parents, officials and parents, refs and parents. There's a connection here in terms of the conflict that can explode in those scenarios. So the key piece here, and I apologize, I did have some animation in the actual presentation, so all of this wouldn't have come up all at once. But my question here was, what types of conflict are at play in that scenario that I just provided you? And I think we inherently immediately go to the relationship conflict. So we immediately focus on what was intense and emotional and everything that I highlighted in red from that scenario. But for me, now that I've had time, so several years to reflect, so I've had, about 3.5 years to reflect back on this situation, is to say the core of what was happening was the task conflict. So in that moment, the play on the field wasn't aggressive, in my opinion, and didn't warrant a penalty. But that's where the father disagreed. But because his concerns hadn't been answered in the past, and something else might have been going on that day as well, but because his concerns hadn't been addressed in the past, he immediately went to this emotional outburst. And that's where the really negative outcomes had occurred. And so if I'm looking back at it now from this view of saying, okay, there are various levels of disagreement, that task conflict was the impetus for what was happening, but then it blew up into and triggered this relationship conflict. So that's happening. And the other piece that I really want to address too, in terms of me being with my coach's hat on, was the intrapersonal conflict that I then went through that day in the moment, and then also several weeks after. So I was thinking in the moment, where is this individual coming from? Why is he so angry? It was blowing my mind. I couldn't believe it. And then to the question in the question period, I was thinking, is this because I'm a woman? Like, is this why he's reacting that way? And that's sort of a hindsight. It wasn't in the moment. I was just terrified in that moment. But this is what I was thinking about as I was driving home that day, and some of the conversations with myself and with my husband that night. But I was terrified. That's a key piece here. And if we come back to sort of the safe sport space around conflict, I was absolutely terrified in that moment. And then part of that too, if we're talking about confidence, being a female in this space, I was a highly competitive soccer player. I will be honest, I know the game backwards and forwards. That moment, I questioned myself. Do I even know what I'm doing? What could I have done differently? My confidence was 100% shattered in that moment, to the point where I said, I'm not coaching anymore. I can't coach in this youth sports space. I'm not doing it. Or after some reflection, and I used my network, I used the allies in my space. Okay, I'm not coaching alone again. That's not going to happen, because hopefully that will protect me and give me a safe sports space if something like this ever happened again. So that was what was going through me internally. So saying that, this is then when I come back to the next points on this slide, is to say, well, then how do we manage safe sports spaces where conflict is going to occur? So I come back to my original point. Conflict is inevitable. We can't prevent disagreements. This is just who we are. Human nature is to disagree, and disagreement is functional. We can't just try and stop disagreement from occurring. So how do we create safe sports spaces to proactively manage some of these explosions in terms of this relationship conflict, but then also reactively manage? So recognizing that after the fact, there needs to be some things that are managed so that we can make girls and women feel safe in this space. So the first point that I have here is create safe spaces where coaches are not alone. So I give a lot of credit to the context that I was in. I didn't ever really feel alone. I highlight that I was terrified, but I never felt alone because there's multiple games going on at once. The convener was there and jumped in immediately. So I didn't feel alone in that space. And I think it's really important that we are creating contexts, particularly for female coaches, where we're not in a space where we're alone. And that's important too, not only for coaching, but if we think of referees and officials. Someone can't feel alone in that space because that is terrifying, but it's also not safe in a lot of ways. So creating spaces where we're not coaching alone. So recognizing that from the club level, and then now for my own peace of mind, I've created my own space moving forward in this coaching world where I'm not coaching alone. I always know I have an assistant coach with me to help me through these decisions. It's my husband in this case when we're coaching our children, but I just recognize whoever that other person is, I will be coaching with someone as I move through my career as a volunteer coach. Also, coming back to the point that was made or asked in the question period, training and orientation, the value of training and orientation. And again, I highlight that I missed that piece. And moving forward, I know I'm not going to skip training and orientation, or if I've missed it, I will go back and make sure that training and orientation occurs. Because perhaps during that training and orientation, it could have been emphasized the value of connecting with the parents about some of the issues that this particular father had, for my example, on the field. And then, as I said, I never addressed his earlier concerns, and I should have. And maybe through orientation and training, there could have been a way that I could have known how to address those concerns such that it didn't blow up into what happened on that field that day. Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know if I could have prevented that in any way, but if I'm looking and I'm reflecting, that is a piece that I could have done differently. And then finally, follow up with coaches who experience this type of conflict. The one gap for me as a coach that never happened was that the club never followed up with me. They certainly knew I had been involved in this. I had been followed up with in terms of just documenting. They were trying to make it so that the father couldn't be on the field for several weeks afterwards as a punishment. So they knew I was involved, but there was no follow-up in terms of my well-being to make sure that I was okay following that interaction. And I know that the other coach as well didn't have that follow-up. So from a club perspective, it's recognizing 100% there's an administrative side to dealing with those issues, but there's also a developmental side and a personal side. So making sure that our coaches are well, and then they're in a good space following those particular episodes when relationship conflict explodes, when there's any type of disagreement or interaction. I think that's really, really important message to take home. So saying that, moving forward, let's make conflict productive. Look for signs of task conflict and proactively manage so it doesn't explode into these relationship conflicts. Make sure we're mindful of fostering, creating, and ensuring a safe sports space before and after the conflict. And the one thing that I want to highlight for you, if you're athletes and you're thinking about coaching and you're moving in that space, don't run away from conflict. Use your network, use the allies around you, communicate, make sure you talk through some of these situations that may occur in your space and become stronger from that interaction. Because I really want to highlight that you belong in the sports space. These conflicts can sometimes make us feel like we don't belong here, but you do belong, and we'll move forward to making that disagreement productive and have some positive outcomes as us as females in sport. So saying that, thank you very much for giving me this space. Absolutely love to hear more questions if we have any from the crowd.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, that was an amazing presentation. We do have a question. I think I accidentally missed it with all the questions coming in, but we will address it now. So this is from, she said, I was a catcher in softball, and when I was young during a game, the male umpire was resting his hands on my hips before every pitch. It made me so uncomfortable, but he was also calling the game, so I didn't want to address it because I thought it might change the calls we were getting. I didn't know what to do. What might you have done, or what might should have happened during this situation?
Yeah, so sorry.
So she was the catcher in softball, and the male umpire would rest his hands on her hips during the game.
Yeah, and this comes back to a lot of things happening there. First, I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Part of that is the power dynamic in that situation. So I recognize what you're saying is that in that space, you're thinking, okay, this individual is calling these games, and am I willing to bring this up in a way that might make him feel uncomfortable, and then therefore it might impact our play on the field. 100% understand where you're coming from in terms of that level of discomfort, and also the power dynamic at play. So I really apologize that you had to go through that. The biggest piece here is recognizing the power dynamic and using your network and using your allies. So one, speaking to your coach about that situation. And in that moment, it's on the coach. So it's not on you as the player. You've done nothing wrong. It's on the coach to then step up and be your advocate, to then talk to the umpire about that, because absolutely that's unacceptable. If it's making you uncomfortable, then it is wrong. So whether or not someone's intention is is for anything ill will in terms of intention, it is making you uncomfortable. So it needs to be addressed. So in that situation, going to your coach, going to a trusted individual, whether it's assistant coach, maybe another parent, to talk to the umpire, absolutely is something that you can and should do. I recognize that that's hard to do in the situation that you describe, and also highlighting that you did nothing wrong in that situation, and you can have a voice. I don't know if I answered your question, but I appreciate what you're saying.
Sure, thank you. That was a great, not a great scenario, but a great scenario to bring up for everyone to learn off of, and for your knowledge to help us in a future experience when something might have happened. So kind of going off of that question, situation, just a question. In terms of conflict, when sometimes, for example, myself, I'm not very good with conflict, what would be one piece of advice in terms of, like, if I'm in a situation that has conflict or tension, what would, like, one piece of advice be to be able to speak your voice, but, in a way that's respectful and as well as, like, appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. I always find, and I will readily admit too, like, I've not always been comfortable in conflict situations, especially in the moment. So I find that one of the things that has been helpful for me over the last several years is to recognize that in the moment, you might not necessarily say the things that you want to say, but when you've taken a step back, it's certainly okay to readdress the disagreement or conflict that you've engaged in. And one of the things that always helps me, and this is, hopefully it came out a little bit in my reflection on the situation with the father, is that in the moment I was extremely upset and I couldn't see the forest through the trees, but stepping back, I recognized and I tried to see the situation from his perspective. I don't know the individual well at all, but it helped me to unpack the conflict situation by thinking, okay, where is he coming from? His parental identity was certainly coming in. It was just a slight protective instinct. And that has helped me in a lot of other conflicts, whether it's in the work setting, other conflicts when I've been coaching, even in interpersonal relationships, is really trying to step back and think about what's happening with this person in that moment. If they've exploded on you in the conversation, is it really you as the individual? Are you the target, or is something else going on for that individual, and really trying to unpack that? It's hard in the moment to do that, but I've used that as a reflective process afterwards that sometimes has helped me repair relationships when it's relationship conflict in the moment is harder to do. So I do challenge you to think of those situations and then what's happening that might be beyond the actual target of the disagreement, what's going on around it that might help you rationalize the situation.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that I'm sure many people have probably been in a situation of conflict where they didn't know what to do and they didn't know exactly how to address it. But I think in terms of what you've provided of reflection, that could definitely help and even better understand in the future when something happens, how you can, better react or respond in ways. And I think we have time for one last question before we're ending the conference. And so this is from Melissa. She said, what advice might you give to team captains about conflict management and resolution in a team setting where you are dealing with your peers?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that question. And part of it comes back to this notion of trying to unpack the task conflict, because it's usually a task or process conflict that leads to this immediate relationship conflict, which is what is really negative in the situation. And the example that I can provide you that maybe adds some context here is, so when I was playing for my club level team, so this is a long time ago, one of the issues that we had was that there was a lot of relationship conflicts. After we won the nationals, there was an influx of new players that came on the team. So there was this reshift in the culture and identity of the team because we had our core group that was with us during the championship, and then we had about 5 or 6 new players that had come in. So one of the things that had happened was that there started to be a lot of disagreement in terms of, there was a lot. There was a breakdown. The culture of the team became quite poor 2 or 3 years after that championship because of this unmanaged disagreement that was happening. And I think from the captain perspective, what needed to be done was sort of to take that step back and say, okay, what's at the core of all of these disagreements? And there was this divide between the new and the old that was never addressed. So there was no welcoming in of the new players into the system and an introduction to, one, recognizing the way things that we did before might not necessarily work because of this new group, and sort of embracing that new team culture that has come in. We didn't make that shift. And so I think one of the things as a captain that you need to reflect on is what's happening in group dynamic. And this takes a bit of experience. This is what's happening in the group dynamic to cause that breakdown. So in the example that I provided, it was taking the step back to say, okay, maybe we need sort of not a workshop, but when we sort of take the team away and sort of get to know each other again. We never did that. And so with the coaching staff decided several years later, we need to regroup. We need to take the team away. We need to go on a team building exercise. And that helped rebuild and manage some of the conflict that was occurring. So a long-winded answer to say, you have to try and figure out what's at the core of the problem. Is it a difference of personality? Is it a long-standing fight that just needs to be resolved? Or the two people just need to be in the same room and just get it out? What is it that's happening? And address it rather than silence. The worst thing you could do is just leave that to fester in terms of the silence that can occur after disagreement. So it's trying to figure out what's at the core, and then don't keep that silent. Make sure we're addressing it.
Those are some great answers. On behalf of everyone here, we just wanted to thank you for taking the time to present to us. You did a great job talking about conflict in sport with your own experiences, and even helping people with their own experiences. And so we just wanted to thank you. And we really appreciate the time you've spent here. So thanks.
Oh, no, thanks for having me. And I did notice in the chat, I think it was Christine said that there's this rule to take 24 hours before you. Absolutely, that's a great suggestion. And it comes back to Allison's point, remove the emotion and try and figure out the core. And however you can do that is a great strategy. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for everyone. Feel free to go back to the sessions and join the last final conference. So yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Victoria.